All right, it is 2:45, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'll admit one more person in. Welcome to this session. Thank you for joining us today. This is Michigan Lakes and Streams Association's 60th annual conference. We want to thank our sponsors for supporting this event and helping us to provide it for free. And I am Melissa DeSimone. I am the executive director of Michigan Lakes and Streams Association, and you are working within the watershed with Matt Meersman, and he is from the St. Joe River Basin Commission. So we're happy to have him here today. He kind of splits his time between Michigan and Indiana, so we're glad he's on our side today, even virtually. You'll notice that your camera is off, your microphone is muted, and that's just to help us to reduce some background noise. You will also see on the bottom the chat. You can click on that and use that to ask us questions today. And we may even, depending upon the size of the crew, do some unmuting and some questions in person as well. So keep that in mind. And I want to thank Matt for joining us today. A little bit about him. He developed a strong connection to the water growing up near the St. Joe River and spending summer weekends at his family's lake cottage in southern Michigan. He now lives along the river in downtown South Bend and works as the director of the St. Joe River Basin Commission. He also serves as the president of the Friends of the St. Joe River Association. His passion for protecting the water comes from a love of being on it and in it. And when he's not working on watershed projects, you will likely find him paddling canoes and kayaks on lakes and rivers in Southwest Michigan and Northern Indiana. So thank you very much, Matt, for joining us today. And I'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Melissa. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Let's see. Hopefully folks can see the mouth of the St. Joe River up in Benton Harbor, St. Joe. I will show some maps later that kind of orient you all to where I am here. But like Melissa said, I live on the St. Joe River in downtown South Bend, and I'm here at home today presenting this. I think it's sort of important for me just to get this together to kind of go through a little outline of what I want to talk about today. I don't have a slide for it, but I just want to tell you folks that if I could retitle this, it would be Going Beyond the Shoreline, and really how we expand our opportunities by looking beyond, the river's edge or the lake's edge. So I'm going to talk about the importance of including all stakeholders in our work, and how polluted runoff, that problem actually expands our stakeholder universe. And then a little bit about how we determine just what that stakeholder universe is. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do to improve that stakeholder universe, otherwise known as watershed, which could be a dirty word. And I'll talk about why that is. So first of all, as Melissa mentioned in my introduction, I always think it's really important to start with a little about me. Just so you guys know, she had it in the introduction. My passion comes from a love of being on the water. For those of you who may be from Northern Michigan, you might know a little bit about this crazy sport of marathon canoe racing. Most people down here in Indiana have never heard of it. But it's been a love of my life for about 15, 20 years almost now. The biggest race in North America is up on the AuSable River, and this is a picture from a couple of years ago of my partner and I sprinting for our position in this crazy 120-mile race to Lake Huron. Starts in the town of Grayling with a running start where 100 teams are sprinting down the street trying to make their way to a tiny little AuSable River, where we get started at about 9 o'clock at night and end up down in Oscoda on Lake Huron the next day around lunchtime. So was canceled last year due to COVID, but everybody's really hopeful that it's actually going to happen this year. So I'm super excited, been out on the river training for this stuff. And really that time I spent on the river is sort of what keeps me going and inspires me to do this work, which If I could call it anything, it'd be watershed management is the kind of work that I do now. I've been doing it for a while with a lot of different hats and titles. Melissa mentioned serving as the president of the Friends of the St. Joe River Association. I've done that for, probably as long as I've been canoe racing or longer. And about 5 years ago, I got the job as the director of the St. Joseph River Basin Commission, which is kind of really exciting because it does finally match up the geography with a wage paying job that I'm so interested in. I've always been interested in the St. Joe, done the work as a volunteer with the Friends, and finding this role with the commission has really been cool. A little bit about the commission, because it's something unique to Indiana. We have a handful of them here in Indiana, but we're technically an agency of the state, part of the DNR that was created to address water quality issues back in the 80s. At that time, the St. Joe was being heralded as a world-class fishery. We have the salmon and steelhead that come up from Lake Michigan and spawn. We had the two states DNRs working together with the local power company, building fish ladders up and down the river to make these sport fish available all the way up to almost Elkhart, Indiana. And right around that same time that all this excitement was there for promoting the St. Joe as a recreational resource, the state departments of environmental management realized that the river wasn't meeting water quality standards. And so how could we promote this as a thing to come and fish and play on when we're also supposed to be advising people that they shouldn't be in full contact with it? So they got the idea to build this commission, and actually the roots of the commission in terms of who is on the commission really kind of matches up well with what I want to talk about today, which is sort of expanding that stakeholder universe. We've got 32 statutory members of this commission from a lot of different program areas, but all with a hand in water management. And we can talk later if you guys are curious about the commission and exactly its makeup. But really the idea is we got people from all over the area that drains to the St. Joe, from public health to drainage to stormwater. All kinds of aspects of water management are included in this commission to help try to improve the management of our resource. So with that, that's the agency I work for. I feel lucky to do this. And so now I'm going to talk to you about that dirty word a little bit. I'm just going to touch on it because I'm not going to probably be able to avoid saying it during this presentation. So why I say watershed is a dirty word is because it's the fact is a lot of people don't really understand what it is. I would imagine that the group that's here at this conference today is far more likely than most to have heard of it or understand it. But I don't take that for granted. So when I'm talking about a watershed, I'm simply talking about the area of land that drains to a particular body of water. And there's always this imaginary line that you could go to and pour a bucket of water one way, and the water is going to flow to one river, and you pour it the other way, and it's going to flow to another river. And I say river because I actually sit here in South Bend, real close to the Continental Divide, not the east-west one, the north-south one. So I've got a spot where I go hiking and running just about every week that's actually on the Continental Divide. And when I'm running on one side of the hill, the land is draining to the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi. And when I'm running on the other side of the hill, it's draining to the St. Joe and Lake Michigan. So, but you can go and break this down much further, which we'll talk more about later. But I have to touch on it now because I will inevitably say it. So first of all, just a little bit of understanding about why it's so important that we include all these stakeholders. So if you look back in time, I mean, 50 years ago or so, most of our water quality problems were linked to discharges from factories or wastewater treatment plants. But today, about 40% of our nation's waters do not meet their water quality standards because of runoff from streets, farms, yards, parking lots, and other sources. And addressing polluted runoff requires the commitment and participation of a variety of stakeholders. When we're dealing with those discharges from factories and wastewaters, it's easy to go right to that facility and do the work. When we're dealing with polluted runoff, it's coming from all over the place, and that instantly expands that universe to be really big. And I should say that initially there was some anxiety around that for me, you know, like, oh my gosh, I got all these more people to deal with. But really, I now see it as increased opportunity rather than increased people to bring on board, because you just a lot better chance of success the larger the net that we can cast is. So this is nothing, you know, original for me or anything. This comes straight out of EPA's handbook on doing watershed management plans. You got to engage stakeholders. You want to get them in early. It builds trust and support for the process. It helps to share responsibility for decisions that might be made. So whether you're creating a watershed management plan or just trying to work on a project for your lake, getting people at the table, all kinds of people, even the ones that might be opposed, and maybe especially the ones that might be opposed to it, because it's going to lead to better and stronger working relationships. So, first start in the process has got to be identifying your stakeholders. And, it's not always easy identifying stakeholders. It's hard, but the more you can identify, hopefully the more potential partners you might have. A stakeholder is someone with a vested interest, but a partner is someone who actually ends up coming to the table and helping to develop or implement the plans and ideas you have in place. So, thinking about casting that net wide hopefully leads to a potential for an even greater number of partners in the effort that you're trying to do. So how about for you all out there? I tend to think a lot with MLSA about lake associations, and I think, who are your stakeholders? And I would imagine that, your neighbors around the lake probably come to mind. And of course they are. And that's usually the folks that we're doing outreach to join our lake association, to plant some native shoreline, to do that kind of work. For me here on the St. Joe River, when I got started, it was back to the pipes and discharges. Unless you're located in a really rural setting, it's easy to think of these as the large polluters, the things that we need to clean up. And there's no doubt that at one time they were. This is actually the wastewater treatment plant just downstream of my house here in South Bend. I paddle by it all the time. I've been told by what have become friends that work at this wastewater treatment plant that the water that's coming out of this treatment plant is cleaner than the water in the river, that they sample it every day and it's clean. But I can't shake it out of my head. When I paddle by that, it's the last place that I want to tip over and fall out of my canoe. So there's definitely a large roadblock for many of us around sort of turning our attention away from the pipes and large discharges towards a problem that's a lot harder to get a handle on. And why did that change? I mean, there was no question that at one time those pipes and discharges were our biggest problem, back when rivers were on fire and all that stuff. Fortunately, we've got something called the Clean Water Act, and it was strengthened back in 1972 with a goal of having all of our waters be fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. At that time, the regulations got placed on factories and other discharges, and they made a dramatic impact on some of our most polluted waters. But we're still a long way from having fishable, swimmable, and drinkable surface waters everywhere, including here in the St. Joe. So, the thing with EPA and many of us that work in watershed management is, how do we take this next step? We got such tremendous gains through the passage of the Clean Water Act, through the regulation of discharges, the fact that you have to meet standards if you're going to discharge out of a pipe to the river. We got tremendous improvement out of that, but we still have a long way to go. How do we do that? And right now, there really isn't much in place in the way of regulation on runoff that can help us do that. So we're faced to do that largely on a volunteer basis. What it means for me is that if we're going to meet these goals, we have to focus on this polluted runoff, and it's coming from urban sources for sure here in my watershed, but also, and maybe more importantly, from agricultural sources. And I say more importantly, not because these sources are any worse, but it just happens to be that in my watershed, a majority of the land that drains to the river is used for agriculture of some kind. So we're definitely looking at the different sources of runoff when we try to think of who we need to engage in our project to improve our lake or stream. I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of the folks that I'm working with, and these actually not the particular individuals, the kinds of entities that we're usually targeting with our outreach. So we're talking municipal officials, folks in stormwater, wastewater. These folks can also be involved in Department of Public Works, snow and salting procedures that go on. These all have a potential impact on your water body, and they're people that you'd like to have at the table when you're discussing the problems that are going on in your lake or stream. I mentioned agriculture. This is an Indiana thing, but this is actually a nationwide thing. This is the, you won't recognize this probably. This is the logo for our state association of soil and water conservation districts. But of course, Michigan has strong county conservation districts. We got one in every county, and they work with farmers all the time, along with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a federal agency. They work with farmers to improve their management practices and reduce runoff on their farms. They've often become an important partner, gone from stakeholder to partner, as they often lead watershed management projects that engage stakeholders. And if you're not talking to them already, I would guess that your local county conservation district is going to be a huge resource for you when it comes to engaging stakeholders in terms of identifying your watershed and knowing, what to do with folks once you do make contact with them, what's out there in the way of possibilities and what hurdles exist. I can't say enough about the county conservation districts. I used to work at one, and I just really think they're the boots on the ground that actually end up directly contacting and working with a lot of the landowners that we care so much about. So, you might have a boat launch on your lake, or, there might be a park, something like that, public property. So, local parks and recreation departments, as well as the DNR, they're also important stakeholders. Their missions depend on clean water. And so they can also often be good folks to have at the table. Another one that's become popular, over the last 5 to 10 years is outdoor recreational groups, paddlers groups. I know Michigan DNR has a big water trails movement, and we've worked with a lot of these groups, local friends of the river that often centered around recreation and paddling, or could be fishing. But we've worked with them on river cleanups and water trail establishment, and these are folks that already care a lot about the river. So they're kind of, someone that you can count on in a lot of cases to be an ally on your project or mission. So it's great to reach out to the recreational groups that may be using your river or your lake. I can imagine that, there can be issues sometimes too, with thinking of boaters and wake issues, all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, it's not always a, easy relationship to manage, but again, some of those difficult relationships are the ones you really need to get at the table, because you want those people engaged and you need to understand their perspective if you're going to be effective in what you're doing. So back to that question, who are your stakeholders? What about the farmer who lives 5 miles away from your lake or stream? Is that someone that you need to be concerned about? This brings us back to going beyond the shoreline and the theme of this talk here. We're back to the watershed concept. That land that farmer 5 miles away owns may be draining to your lake or stream. And, there could be a nature preserve 2 miles away that's filtering the water that's coming from that farm. So it's important to know where your water is coming from. Going beyond the shoreline expands our opportunities for engaging stakeholders and making a difference. So if you don't know your watershed already, I want you to learn what it is. And there's kind of an interesting thing when we think about learning our watershed. First, I'm going to talk just a little bit. I'm not going to talk much about it, but I'm going to show you some slides that kind of give you a sense of where we are. I mentioned that I'd show you where I am. This big yellow outline is the Great Lakes Basin, or the watershed of the Great Lakes. I mentioned that I go running and hiking down here right on the Continental Divide, right up here. So just beyond that is that land that's draining to the Kankakee. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, the yellow line now is focused on the land that's draining to Lake Michigan. And you can see, the largest watersheds of Lake Michigan, and you got a little graphic up there that kind of tells you where we rank amongst them. The St. Joe River is actually the 3rd largest watershed draining to Lake Michigan, and it's split between the states of Indiana and Michigan. So, the Grand gets its name for a reason. It's the 2nd largest watershed of Lake Michigan, the largest on our side of the lake. The Fox over there in Wisconsin is the largest. So zooming in a little further, just into our watershed, the St. Joe River Basin watershed, interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. This gives you an idea of some of the significant tributaries to the St. Joe and how big their watersheds are. The largest sub-watershed of the St. Joe is the Elkhart River. The Paw Paw River is not too far behind it. And then somewhere down the line, oh, looks like all the way down in number 10 is Melissa's watershed. I think her lake, Gravel Lake, somewhere right up in here somewhere. And I know we got some folks from Eagle Lake, which is down here. So, just to get a sense of this watershed. Now, these are sort of just named watersheds. Some of them may coincide with what's known as a hydrologic unit code. It's a really jargony term that's used by those of us in the business. It's used by USGS extensively. I'm going to bring it up in terms of finding your watershed. I mentioned that we all have this sort of what you might think of as a watershed address. And, if we go back to thinking about, the Lake Michigan Basin within the Great Lakes Basin, and then the St. Joe River Basin within the Lake Michigan Basin, and then the Elkhart River within the St. Joe, these are all nested. And so, when you say, well, my watershed is the Gravel Lake watershed, well, it's the Gravel Lake watershed of the Rocky River watershed of the St. Joe watershed of the Lake Michigan water, so on and so forth. And the USGS has come up with a naming convention for these things that involves numbers. And the larger the basin is, the fewer numbers that are in the address. So I'm not really proficient with these numbers, but the idea is that if you're in the Great Lakes Basin, it's 04. And then if you're in the Lake Michigan Basin, it's 0415. Whereas if you were in Lake Erie, it might be 0416. I'm not right with those numbers. I don't know for sure, but that's the idea. And you can keep on going down to the point where you end up with a 12-digit number, and 12-digit is going to be even smaller. Like, for example, the Dowagiac is probably like a 10-digit HUC. Same with the Rocky River HUC, hydrologic unit code. But we go much smaller than that. You can get down to the level of, say, Cedar Creek or Mill Creek or some of these smaller ones that would be considered a 12-digit HUC. Now, how do you find your watershed? I went looking on the internet because I'm guessing most of you probably don't have access to GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, but it's a software and a tool that's used by a lot of us in the business, and it really does expand the kinds of things you can do, the kinds of information you can find, data processing, all that kind of stuff. But there's some tools online. In fact, there's free GIS tools online if you can figure out how to use them. And there's a bunch of open source GIS stuff now. But without even doing GIS, you should be able to figure out what your watershed is. And there's some tools out there on the internet. So if you just Google finding your watershed, the first hit that you get is a USGS webpage. And that will allow you to start burrowing down in. The website will look something like this. You'll click on the Great Lakes Basin. That'll bring up a bunch of probably 8-digit HUCs that drain, or excuse me, then you'll have to click on the Lake Michigan Basin. And then eventually you keep nesting in and you'll get down to that. I think on this page, it may only bring you down to an 8-digit. So you might get to something like the size of the St. Joe Basin. You say, well, how do I go beyond that? Well, it kind of depends where you are. The next return, maybe 2 or 3 down on that Google list, gave me this ArcGIS online map that I was able to pan over to Michigan and go all the way down to my 12-digit HUC level. I didn't bother to take a screenshot of it, but if you just kept zooming into where you are, more watershed boundaries appear, and eventually you can figure out which one you're in. I'm going to do that with this other website. This is another USGS site called StreamStats, really incredible, powerful tool. But you take a map and you start zooming in, and eventually you get far enough where, a smaller, thinner gray line exists. And these thinner gray lines are the boundaries of a 12-digit HUC. So this is as small as the USGS goes in defining a watershed. And I don't know whether it's intuitive just from looking at this photo or not, but if you were on this lake here, you'd pretty much know what your watershed is. You'd be pretty much, this entire gray outlined area is draining down to your lake and then out to this next smaller one. So if your lake happens to be located at the bottom of a 12-digit HUC, well, then that 12-digit HUC is your watershed. That's your area of interest. That's your stakeholder universe that you're going to be concerned about. But many of us, our lake is not so conveniently located at the bottom. And I'm just going to run through an example of this little lake up here, which is clearly not at the bottom of this 12-digit HUC. What if I was interested in this lake and wanted to know what my watershed is there. Well, there are some tools for doing that. You zoom in a little bit further, we can see that that lake is called Adams Lake. This is down in LaGrange County, Indiana, just one tier south of the state line. You zoom in a little further and all of a sudden these little flow lines pop up. And these are made from using topography data, basically. You might have heard of LIDAR or elevation data. This is what shows the shape of the surface of the earth. And with this GIS software, they can define where water would accumulate and flow. So everywhere that you see on here that's a blue line may or may not actually be a stream or a drain or a ditch. It may just be a low swale where water collects when we do have heavy rain. But nonetheless, this tool will allow you to take your pointer and stick it anywhere on one of these blue flow lines, and you click on it, and it's going to delineate the watershed upstream of that. So when I clicked on Adams Lake, I was able to get a watershed boundary, of this upper portion of that 12-digit HUC, but not the portion downstream. So if I'm working on Adams Lake, this is going to help me understand what my watershed is. Unfortunately, as I was doing this, I found out that Michigan does not participate in the USGS Stream Stats program. I don't know what's going on. There's a thing for it to you contact them, but I thought this was almost like a public service announcement to let you guys know, and up there in Michigan, you're one of only like 6 states that's not participating in this. This tool is incredibly powerful, so we need to get on the horn with someone to get you guys on board with this, because it's an incredible tool. Nonetheless, this stuff can be done without Stream Stats. I mentioned your Soil and Water Conservation District. They may be someone that can help you with some of this GIS stuff. If you can't figure out what your watershed is, they may have the resources or tools to help you do that. It's certainly something that watershed groups like mine would like to help our members with. But once you've got an idea of what your watershed is, all of a sudden you kind of know who the people are that matter. And that does require one extra step that's important. And I think this is one of the most powerful geographic information layers there is, and that's our parcel data. Now, depending on what county you live in, this data may be easy or difficult to come by. In many of our Indiana counties, it's real easy. It's on the internet. You can go out there, you can zoom into where your property is, and you can see your parcel boundaries. And that's the magic part. With GIS, you can do a selection and find out who all the people are that, at least the property owners by name on the tax record, who all the people are that drain to your lake or who drain to your stream. When it comes down to it, the reality is that the individual decisions, rather, of these hundreds, if not thousands of private property owners are what ultimately impacts the health of your lake or stream. So the fact that you may be able to have access to the addresses of all these people is pretty powerful stuff. And, you can do much further analysis beyond that to look at who owns significant parcels. I mentioned maybe the farmer's land drains through a wetland that's protected. You can see who owns that wetland. Is it protected already? That kind of thing. But anyway, getting to that property owner information and realizing that it's more than just the parcels that touch the lake. It's all those parcels that are draining to the lake that we think about, or we should be thinking about if we want to have the ultimate impact on our resource. So with that, I'm going to talk now. I'm going to transition into what do we do about it once we figured it out. So we figured out who it is, who's there. And I can't help talking about this stuff without using a metaphor of plumbing, and whether it's I think it's a good one. My work here at the commission often has me focused on the behavior of local governments, and many of the things that are being done by local governments are pretty obviously like plumbing. I'm thinking of storm pipes and tile drains that are owned by the county and receive runoff from farm fields, that kind of thing. But the same logic actually applies with private landowners, and there's all kinds of plumbing out there. And I want you to think about our watershed as being one large plumbing system, and that some of it is obvious, like the pipes under the city streets, but some of it isn't. Some of it is intentional, meaning it was put there to collect water, and some of it definitely is not. It's intentional for a whole nother reason, like parking cars on or something. But some is public and some is private, and there's different ways to approach that depending on what it is. But thinking about the plumbing of our watershed is really going to unlock sort of how we think about what we can do. So first, take a step back and realize that this plumbing has existed all the time, or, since the beginning. This is not anything new, the pipes, yes, drain tiles, yes, but the roots of trees, the roots of prairie grasses, accumulations of muck soils, those were all plumbing. They're the way the water moves across the surface and into the planet. So we've had plumbing here forever. What we're thinking about now is how has that plumbing changed as our land cover has changed. So, you go back 100 years and we started to get things that looked more like plumbing. And in the first city sewers were just, collecting runoff off the street. Factories were discharging directly to the river. This is a picture from just upstream of me in Mishawaka, Indiana. And my grandmother, my late grandmother, worked at this factory you see in there, and they made tennis shoes and dyed the leather red. And she said that on the days when they were dyeing those tennis shoes, the whole river would turn red because all the extra effluent just went straight into the river. Pretty obvious that the plumbing of that factory was directly connected to the river. And so you've got some of this obvious plumbing that started to be installed as we started developing. And then if you lived out in the country, you also had a bunch of stuff that's, to me, is pretty obvious that it's plumbing. This is a picture, could be from the Dowagiac River in Southwest Michigan, could be from the Kankakee River in Northwest Indiana. But we had huge dredging projects take place to straighten out rivers and improve drainage, to lower the discharge point so that we could start growing food on land that would otherwise be soggy and wet. This is the installation of plumbing, and this is what we want to be thinking about. So what does it look like now, and where is it? I think that, like I said, the obvious ones are storm drains collected into pipes. But what about what's right next to that? When I do these kind of presentations in person, I often do a little Q&A right here, to ask, what are we looking at on this map? What's all this yellow? Because this is some of our most extensive plumbing that we have in the basin. I could ask you to type it in the chat, but I can't see the chat right now. So I'm guessing you probably figured out this is all the roads in the basin. And all those roads have changed the way water flows dramatically. Not just the ones that have curb and gutter like I showed in the previous ones, but out there in the country too. We've got drains that run next to the roads. The roads themselves convey water in heavy rain events. So we've got plumbing spread all over the place in the form of our transportation network. The ditching and dredging that took place 100, 200 years ago certainly hasn't stopped today. We have all kinds of active drainage projects. Just to give you a little idea, I know this is not the same up in northern Michigan, but down here in southern Michigan, even up in the thumb, we've got a ton of what are called regulated drains or county ditches. They're often open ditches like the slide I showed, but sometimes they're buried tile lines you'd never see, big, large pipes underneath the ground. All these yellow lines on this slide are regulated drains in the St. Joe Basin. And I've just recently done some analysis that shows that almost 70% of the stream miles in our basin are technically regulated drains of some kind. So if we're not thinking about this particular plumbing and how we solve our problems, we're totally missing the mark. I mean, there's no question. And initially that can be really depressing. It's one of these times where it's like, oh my gosh, so much of my watershed is being drained by a ditch. Oh, that's terrible. But there's a silver lining in that maybe. I mean, when it's a regulated drain, that means that there is a central authority that's responsible for managing it. It also means that there's a funding mechanism in place to raise funds to do work on these water bodies. So yes, is that work often damaging? Yeah, but it can also be done better. And there are ways to do it better. And more our drainage officials are recognizing the multiple needs that exist in the watersheds. And I think there was one of our drain commissioners was presenting earlier in this conference. And I know there's some exciting things going on the Michigan side with drainage and creating an incentive for better management. So, I've kind of hit on two things that are a little easier to understand as plumbing when we talk about drains and ditches. We talk about roads, you can see the map of this network that exists. But honestly, land cover and the management of it is probably the largest piece of our plumbing system. And that goes back to that slide. I said we had plumbing from the start. And we still have some of that same plumbing now. In our natural areas, we may still have deep-rooted prairie grasses. We might still have trees in some places. But even where we don't, basically where we don't have pavement, we've got something growing there or we got bare earth. And depending on what's growing there or the absence of anything growing there has a dramatic impact on the water that runs off of there. Not only how much, but what it looks like. And the slide that you're looking at now is something that's used by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's used often to work with farmers to help understand how the management of a cropping system can dramatically impact how much water is going to be available late in the summer. It also, the little buckets that you can see on the front show what's running off of the field when you get a rain event. So basically there's these little trays in there that have all different kinds. It's all the same soil, but one of those soils has got grass living on it. One of them's got some detritus on the top. One may have, a crop in it. I can't tell exactly. I mean, but each one of them is theoretically a different tillage scenario, a different management scenario. And we throw the same exact amount of rain at all of them and we see what comes off. And what you see is that, the color of them is the first dramatic thing you see, but also the amount of water that's sitting in. There's not much water coming off of that one that's got grass on it. Well, what they do after they do this demonstration initially, and you see, wow, look how dirty that water is. Look how much of my topsoil left the field. They pull away that little white panel that's behind all those buckets hanging there. And there's an equal number of buckets underneath that show how much water has infiltrated down into the soil. And it's the inverse relationship. So those ones that are loaded full of dirty water have next to nothing in the bucket hanging underneath that management scenario, whereas the one with grass has a bunch of water. That's the water that's going to be available for growing crops later in the year. So anyway, this is particularly, this slide is geared towards agricultural land, but you can think of the same thing in our parks. You can think of the same thing in your yard in terms of thinking about how we manage the plants that are growing there can have a dramatic impact on how much water and the quality of the water that's leaving our property. This little map, again, probably not interesting to you guys, but for me, with GIS, we can do analysis. We can look at, I think I mentioned that something like 70% of the land in the St. Joe Basin is used for agriculture of some kind. So pretty much everywhere you see on there that's orange or yellow is ag land of some kind. What you see in gray is our urban areas. I'm in the densest urban area down there in the south bend of the river. And then the green is the positive thing. And you should notice one thing on this slide, and that is there's a whole lot more green on the Michigan side of our basin than there is on the Indiana side. And there's no question that means that some of our best waters are up there on the Michigan side of the line. There's just no question about it. So one last thing to think about with this land cover stuff, in addition to how we manage it in general, the installation of subsurface drainage systems and the resulting loss of storage has a dramatic impact on our water bodies. Sometimes this is a picture of tile being installed in a field. There's hundreds and hundreds of miles of tile being installed just in my basin every year. And this is so that farmers can get out on the field earlier with their tractors. They can get on to get the crops off. It's all done for a good reason. These farmers are not trying to drain our wetlands. But the result of all this historic drainage work we've done, we've tried to improve the way water moves off the system, has resulted in dramatic wetland loss. This map here is showing our basin, and all the areas in red are the wetlands that used to exist and no longer do. The areas in green are what's still wetland, and these are estimates based on the National Wetland Inventory. But again, you'll see that Indiana was way ahead of Michigan in our effectiveness of draining wetlands, and that definitely reduced the amount of natural land cover, and it has dramatically reduced the amount of storage that we have on our side of the basin. So we experience flooding problems in the Elkhart River that are unheard of up in the Pawpaw River. And there's no better example of two sub-watersheds of the St. Joe than the Pawpaw and the Elkhart in terms of behaving different. They're in the same general region of the country. The soils are not that much different, but that land cover change and that drainage of wetlands and loss of storage has dramatically changed the way those rivers function now. And it's changed the water quality and the amount of water that's coming down them. So these are the kinds of things to think about, and you're able to think about them with a definite boundary when you start understanding what your watershed is. You can characterize your watershed. How much wetlands have we lost? What kind of land cover do we still have? Where's that good land cover at? Do I want to try and reach out to those landowners to let them know about incentives for protecting their land, incentives for restoring their wetlands? There's all kinds of federal programs. There's federal tax incentives for folks to do good things. And a lot of people just don't know about it. Well, you can't go and blanket the whole watershed with information about tax incentives for wetlands, because half the people, probably more than half the people, it's not going to apply to them. But with GIS, with using this watershed boundary and having access to some of this data, you can start targeting your outreach to the people who need to hear this message. So anyway, you know, a lot of times when I give this presentation where I talk about the historic loss of wetlands and how land covers change, people are like, well, what are you saying we should do? You know, obviously we can't turn back the clock and undo all the plumbing we've installed. As much as I might like to at times, we can't do that. We wouldn't be able to feed ourselves. I wouldn't live here where I do, but we can do better. And so the last part of this, I just want to kind of share with you guys some ways that we're trying to do plumbing better. You know, this is another example of the difference in land cover. This is a simple classroom example of the fancy rainfall simulator that I showed earlier. And it's just to say that working with farmers to improve the management of cropland can make a big difference on the water quality downstream. And that may be your lake, depending on how far up in the watershed you are. You know, one of the nice things, some of our lakes are located almost at the top of the watershed. And that certainly does limit the potential pollutant sources that are coming to your lake. And if you're in one of those lakes, you might consider yourself lucky. However, if you're in one of those lakes and you have a problem, it's also a lot less opportunities for trying to make something better. So there is sort of a double-edged sword to that. In our urban areas, you know, very explicitly plumbing, there's all kinds of things we can do. You know, we've got one of our communities down here that really has invested a lot of money in detaining stormwater. You know, it's not always the greenest practice. There's greener ways to do this, but there's no question that investing in these kind of large tanks like this can reduce the amount and the quality, actually more so the quality of the water that's going to enter our stream. Here in South Bend, they've invested in some what are called smart sewer technology. Basically, we're using tanks, or excuse me, valves and sensors. You know, it's South Bend at one time, maybe still, has the most heavily censored sewer system in the world. And we basically can see what's full and what's not. And when we have a big rainfall event, we can close up some valves, open others, pump some water from one part of the city over to the other, and basically make sure every single cubic foot of space in our sewers is full of water before we release any to the river, because that's a real problem we've had here. We've been releasing combined sewer overflows to the river, and it's nasty. I showed you that slide with our road network. There's way better plumbing we can do on our roads, and we've done it here in South Bend a little bit, and it's being done all over the country, and that is pervious pavers. Trying to reduce the amount of impervious surfaces. There are really cool ways for doing parking lots. Pervious pavers are one, but there's even pervious concrete, pervious asphalt. These are certainly things to look at when you're doing working with folks who may be putting in a new driveway, new parking lot, that kind of thing. I showed the slide with the drains all over the place, regulated drains, county ditches. This one is an example in northern Indiana, really close to the Michigan border, but we have some of these in Michigan as well. And when I say some of these, this is a better drain management technique known as a two-stage ditch. Some of you folks may have heard of it. Basically, the way it works is when we channelize and straighten a river or a stream to improve drainage, we disconnect that stream from its floodplain. So when the river comes up or when the stream comes up from heavy rainfall, there's nowhere for the water to go. It's not able to spill out the way it naturally would. So it rips down through what's basically a trapezoidal ditch and tears up the side. Well, if you can lay the banks back and reestablish a miniature, arguably a miniature floodplain down low, when the stream's running at low flow, it's constricted into a small little channel where it can manage its sediment. But when the river comes up, we get a big rain event, it spills out onto its floodplain where you've got, this is freshly done. Eventually they would grow up with nice vegetation in there. That river comes up, or the ditch comes up, and it spills out onto its floodplain where it can drop sediment. And, tests have shown, they've done a lot of research at Notre Dame here on some ditches that have had this practice applied to them. And it's incredible the amount of nutrient reduction that occurs, as well as sediment reduction. So there are better ways to do our ditches. Now, some of the better plumbing that we might want to do is going to require voluntary action. I'd say in some sense, I'm lucky working with the public officials, the local governments, because I feel like we can have a big impact through the change of just one mind. It may be just that county drain commissioner. If we can get him thinking about, or him or her thinking about things a little differently, we can potentially change, 100 miles of ditch to something better. But then there's a lot of things that are just going to require, voluntary action of an individual. And there's a number of things. This is just a silly example of, storm drain marking and trying to change people's mind about how they think about a storm drain, from something that's just a waste, a sewer, some nasty thing where you put dirty stuff, to something that's connected to our river that we care about. We're more likely to care about the stream or the lake. And so how do we make that sewer feel more like the lake, so that people think more like, when I pour something there, I'm pouring it right into the lake? So anyway, one of our communities did a project like that. Agricultural BMPs, I mentioned this earlier, working with your soil and water, or your county conservation district in Michigan, and finding out, what farmers are doing there. What are some of the conservation farmers doing, and how could we maybe increase some of those activities? You on the lake, or anybody in a neighborhood upstream of the lake, can do things on your own property, like creating rain gardens or little areas where water can infiltrate and reduces the direct runoff. I'm here in the city where everything's connected to a storm drain. So the less water that leaves my little city lot, the more I can keep, in a rain garden like this, or in a rain barrel or something, the less that's going into that sewer system, the less that's going to end up getting discharged to the river. So in addition to physical practices at the commission, for me, and I would guess many of you, you're probably going to get involved in some policy issues as well. This is probably where you're going to go beyond your watershed boundary, your stakeholder universe that I talked about earlier. No question, if your watershed includes some local government officials, like a county drain commissioner, the county road commission, you would potentially be looking at policy there, and the salting practices or something like that. But certainly we want to think beyond that, even on a greater scale, whether it be at our state or federal level, because there's a lot of things that we could do better in terms of policy and regulation that could help us improve. I'm fortunate, again, to be able to do this for work. I get to go out to Washington, D.C. and try to advocate for funding for the Great Lakes. And we've been successful with some of that recently. And then here on the state level, this is in Indiana. I told Melissa that I had planned to come here today to talk about this great commission that I work for, and how the state of Indiana was so progressive in creating these river basin commissions to help deal with watershed issues. It's a really innovative and cool idea. All excited about that. And I really suffered a big blow at the state government level yesterday, and it's making it really hard to be proud to be a Hoosier today. I can't go without mentioning that another progressive thing that Indiana did was created its own state wetland regulations to take care of all the wetlands that fell off of the regulatory scope back in, would have been the early 2000s, when the waters of the U.S. was first sort of adjudicated in the Supreme Court, and there was a bunch of small wetlands that lost their regulation. And so here in Indiana, we said, man, we really need these wetlands. We've lost so many already. We're going to create our own state wetland policy. And for 20 years now, we've been regulating wetlands that are much smaller than what the feds would regulate. And Unfortunately, a bill just passed and was signed by the governor last night that pretty much does away with almost our entire state wetland regulatory program. So terrible to end this thing on a sad note, but that's the reality that I'm living in today. And talking to you all is helping with that. So thank you for having me. I know that I'm not at 45 minutes yet. I'm just going to leave you with one thought, and that is changing behavior is always hard. And no matter what, I think it starts with building relationships and trust. So you'll notice the theme running through a lot of what I'm talking about, and that's bringing it back to the people. Who has an impact on your water resource, and how do you engage them? Even the difficult actors you want at the table, and you want to figure out, what motivates them and how we can work together towards a common goal. So with that, Melissa, I'm going to stop and see. I have not seen the chat, so I'll leave this up for a second in case anybody wants my information, but I'll probably take it down so I can see faces.
All right. Yeah. So, a lot, I was trying to put some resources in the chat while you were talking. So some of the things in the chat are just some resources that I put in. Joe Lattimore from MSU did put in a resource for finding Michigan watersheds. It's called the Model My Watershed tool,
Awesome.
modelmywatershed.org. So she put that in so that people can find their watersheds.
Go, Joe. I know, Joe. Thank you. Joe got her start here in my watershed, actually, working on Jude Creek when she was at the University of Notre Dame with Dr. Hellenthal. Sorry, had to put a plug in for you, Joe.
That's all right. We are very happy to have her. So we, let's see. Okay, we had one question in the chat, and then if anybody wants to bring up any, I mean, this is a manageable group. So if you want to unmute yourself and just ask Matt questions, I'm sure that would work. Matt's a pretty hands-on guy, so I'm sure he would enjoy the conversation. But in the chat, we had a question. It says, is there a mapping system for groundwater watersheds for lakes and streams?
Wow, that's a great question. Was just talking to one of my colleagues about groundwater, and I'll look to if anybody else. I don't know of any. It's such a complicated issue. That when we talk about surface water, it's kind of real easy to define the boundaries based on topography. We can see the surface of the earth. We know where the runoff's going, but the cost of understanding groundwater is so high. I mean, you basically have to drill wells all over the place and map the level of those, and then you even send dye down and see if it makes it to the next one to understand if the water's moving one way or the other. I think we know in general that there's some kind of correlation between surface water and groundwater, but it's not clear. There's definitely you wouldn't say the same boundary for groundwater in the St. Joe Basin as what you would say on the surface. So unfortunately, I don't know of any.
Okay, and then actually Tricia Denton mentions that she agrees that Michigan needs this, and that when we were talking with some of our congressmen earlier today, that was something that
groundwater mapping
that we were talking that they were mentioning. I think as it related to septics mostly.
Nice.
And then we had another question about the Portage River. It has a watershed management plan approved in 2016, but there has never been any implementation. Are you?
So yeah, the Portage is in our basin. So I am familiar with it. And my guess is that was probably done through the St. Joe County Conservation District. I know we've got some good folks there, but I also know that they are bare bones when it comes to staff and funding. I mean, that's another thing on the Michigan side of the line. Conservation districts are really struggling for funding oftentimes. Some of them have been successful in getting millages passed, Van Buren County, for an example, down here, but I think Missaukee County up north as well. That's incredibly helpful. But many of them, like St. Joe, were almost broke. I mean, they almost closed up their doors. Carolyn Grace is the administrator there. I mean, she's almost a volunteer in terms of how many hours she's able to bill and get paid for, but she does tremendous work. I would think maybe it's that, just lack of ability, capacity in terms of grant seeking. It may also have something to do with the kinds of implementation that was recommended in the plan. In order to get implementation funding, you basically have to show that it matches up with what the plan said needed to be done. So I'm not sure. I'm not familiar enough with the Portage River plan to know. But my guess is it would be similar to a lot of our other ones. Doing ag BMPs is probably going to be a big one in the Portage.
Yeah. All right. And then we have another question that just came in. Do you have any comment on increased use of drain tiles impacting the speed of ag runoff and potential influence on harmful algal blooms?
Yeah, there's some really cool research being done on this at Michigan State. It doesn't look good. Dissolved. So a lot of times folks in the drain tile industry were, like trying to argue that they were helping us out because the more subsurface drainage meant less sediment laden runoff coming off the top. The problem is now we're dealing with dissolved phosphorus, a lot of times dissolved nutrients, and those move quite rapidly and quite well through that drain tile system. So it's scary. And for me as a manager, one of the things that's really scary about it is not knowing the extent of drainage. We haven't figured out a good way to map it yet. And because it is occurring on private property, there's no requirement of anyone to tell us where the drain tiles are being put in at. And so we really don't know the extent of it. And for me, I can't help but talk about this when this issue comes up. Why aren't drain tiles considered point sources of pollution and therefore regulated under the Clean Water Act? Farm Bureau is going to be a major lobbying force to say no way on that. But man, if there ever was something that looked like a point source, it sure would be that drain tile outlet. So why are we not having to monitor the quality of the water coming out of there? I mean, I'm probably speaking to the choir on that with this group, but sorry, I'll stop.
No, that was good. All right. Does anyone else have any question? There were a couple of comments just clarifying about the Portage River plan and the need for those groundwater, the groundwater mapping, especially for PFAS.
Oh yeah. Well, see, Melissa, we don't have PFAS here in Indiana. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Did I tell you about my? I think I did,
Yeah,
right?
sorry,
We talked about that. No, I was. Well, Matt is just referring to that. When I was taking the Indiana Watershed Leadership course, I mentioned PFAS, and they were people in that. They were from all over Indiana, so they're not necessarily close to the Michigan border, and they were very confused. And I was telling them about it, and one of them went onto the Indiana state site. And it says, oh, well, it says right here that Indiana doesn't have PFAS. And I was like, oh, well, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but yeah. I'm sure you do.
I'm sure we do too. I'm sure we do too.
So, well, I really thought this was great. We're trying to make sure that we're looking at our water outside of just what's in the lake that we can see. And I think you really touched on how to be aware of that and how to incorporate those thoughts into management for your water. It's not just about what you see and what you're enjoying.
I hope so. I mean, I know that I have the luxury of having those tools like GIS that can really help. But what I would say is just for all of you on this, if you're, as a volunteer on a lake, just knowing that they exist and that this kind of analysis can be done, you can be the in the person's ear at you, whether it's your local. I'm throwing the county conservation districts under the bus on this one. Call them up, find out if they can help you with some of this analysis, because they may be able to. In fact, they may be excited about it. So, there's definitely tools and resources out there, even if they're not easy for any one of us to pick up and use. I think it's still important for you to understand that they exist.
Here's a really great question for you, Matt, that just came up in the chat. What is the difference between the commission and the Friends?
Great question, for sure. Sometimes I wonder myself. So the missions are very similar. And the way that I've approached, the most technical difference is that one is an agency of the state of Indiana. The other is a 501c3 not-for-profit. their mission statements are super similar. And even though this one is created by the Indiana General Assembly, it says it encourages us to work with Michigan. It recognizes that the watershed includes 8 counties in Michigan. And so we are encouraged to work with them. One of the biggest differences practically is that the commission has a dedicated funding source in the state and local government, which is really incredible. And that's what I was going to brag about with, Indiana having something like this. This is, I think, over in the east part of Michigan, you maybe have a couple of watershed councils that get some local government funding from them. Huron River, it comes to mind. But here in Indiana, we've got about 4 or 5, and they all receive some money from the state. And then we've been very successful in reaching out to our 6 counties that we serve and getting an appropriation every year that gives us real money to work with. I mean, it's not enough to fix the watershed instantly, but compared to the kind of membership and income we were getting at the Friends, which we are still getting, I mean, there's a big difference in our funding ability. Now, another big difference that I have to speak about is our ability to do advocacy. So the commission in its statute says that we can advocate on behalf of the river. And I was down in Indianapolis arguing why they shouldn't pass that wetlands bill, that anti-wetlands bill. But we have to be really careful about it from a state and local political standpoint. Whereas as a 501c3, I mean, yes, the lawyers will tell me, wait a minute, you can't do lobbying and stuff as a 501c3 too. Well, there's certain kinds that you can and can't do. But we have more freedom in our 501c3 to take a position on things than maybe we do at the commission, and some of it maybe is good with the commission for me. I kind of keeps me in check. I can't push too hard for something that is not embraced by the full spectrum of my membership. And my membership includes county drainage officials. So if I don't get them on board, something important is missing here. And whereas with the Friends, we could say, oh, to hell with the county drain commissioner, this is what needs to be done. And, and there's a time for that. But there's also a reality that if you don't have them on board, good luck. How are you going to get it done? So that kind of helps hold us to it. And lastly, sorry, whoever brought this up.
It was a good question.
I love it. Is that I feel like the Friends can serve as a, right in its name, a friendly kind of group where people who do this, whether you're a volunteer or a professional, we don't care. If you're involved in water management, we want to just be there for each other. We want to talk about what worked and what was cool, what didn't work. Oh my God, can you believe they passed that wetlands bill? The Friends is a place where you can come to and vent about that kind of stuff, brag about that kind of stuff in a way that, we're not going to be able to do that with our county commissioners and our mayors and stuff present at the commission meetings in the same way.
Well, and that was something I was going to mention, having been to both of your meetings, the Friends and the St. Joe River Commission. The commission is very formal. There's representatives from all of the different constituencies, and the business has to be done. It's part of their statute. They have to be there to do that business. Where the Friends, it's purely voluntary, and those are people who really care. So you can see pros and cons for both, right? So you've got a lot of passion with the Friends, and you have, the duty of the commission.
Exactly.
But they, like I said, that can go either way as far as the pros and cons. So.
Yeah, in one sense, it's almost like the power of the commission. When we do sway them on something, you've got real teeth behind it. When the mayor and the county commissioner feel this is the right thing to do, it's probably going to get done. Whereas just because a group of us, water huggers thinks that this is something that should be done, it doesn't mean it's actually going to happen.
My takeaway from the conference is the term water huggers. Thank you for that.
I love it.
All right, everyone. If there isn't any final question, I just really want to thank Matt for joining us today. I've worked with him on and off for the past couple of years and found him very informative and helpful. And so, hopefully we've made some new connections here today too. And yeah, I see some thumbs up. If you want to
Yeah.
react, you can do some clapping or some thumbs up for him.
I see now that I can see the names. I also see another name. Tamara's on here. Tamara does a lot of sampling in the St. Joe Basin. It's good to see her name on here.
Yeah, and she's now leading our cooperative or our MyCore program,
Nice.
the Michigan Clean Water Corps.
You
So
guys,
we're
I mean,
excited to have her.
it's so funny. I've been down here in Indiana. I worked in Michigan. A lot of folks who know me from up there, but I've been down here in Indiana for 5 years and kind of had my head in state politics and stuff like that here. And oh my gosh, you guys don't know how often I wish I was still up in Michigan. And honestly, every weekend, just about, I'm going up to Michigan for a canoe race or to go paddling on one of our better streams in the basin. Don't let any of my commission members hear that.
All right, we won't share this recording with them,
Okay.
but thank you, Matt, again. And for everyone else, we have one more session for you today. We're going to hear from our attorney, Cliff Bloom, about riparian rights, always very popular. He begins in 10 minutes at 4 o'clock. So I will hopefully see you all there. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.